Tom Keller's family begged him to stop. He'd been draining the farm pond for 3 days. For 30 years, that pond was the center of their Kentucky farm, a swimming hole 3 generations had loved. But Tom noticed what nobody else did. It never froze right, never dropped in droughts, cattle wouldn't drink from it. Then the mud split open, revealing a perfectly preserved stone staircase descending into darkness. The quietest man in the family had been right all along. For 58-year-old Tom Keller, the pond had always been a quiet obsession. He'd watched it for 30 years, noting every anomaly. It never froze, never dropped, and his cattle wouldn't drink from it. His grandfather's story never added up. Now, with the water gone, Tom was about to prove the pond was hiding a secret buried for over a century. Tom had inherited the farm from his father, who got it from his father, a stern man named Elias Keller, who bought the land in 1941 and dug the pond that same summer. At least, that was the story everyone told. Elias said he wanted a fishing hole for his sons, and for a while nobody questioned it. But Tom was 13 when he first heard his grandfather contradict the official timeline. Elias was 93 then, sitting on the porch, watching the pond catch the last light. He told Tom the pond was already here when he bought the place. Just a small, muddy watering hole for cattle, he said. He just had it deepened a little. Then he told Tom never to mention it to anyone. 2 weeks later, Elias died, taking the rest of the secret with him. Tom never forgot that porch conversation. He spent the next 3 decades piecing together every inconsistency on the farm. The pond was spring-fed, which made no sense because the nearest spring was half a mile away. In the dead of winter, when the air temperature dropped to single digits and every other body of water in the county froze solid enough to walk on, the Keller Pond barely skimmed over with a thin, slushy layer. In summer droughts, when neighbors scrambled to keep their livestock watered, Tom's pond held steady as a bathtub. It behaved less like a natural body of water and more like something actively controlled. His wife Louise thought he was chasing ghosts. She'd grown up 2 counties over and had learned to swim in that pond the summer they got married. She loved the willow tree that draped over the shallow end, the way the sun hit the water at 6 in the evening. Their 2 sons, both in their 20s now, had caught their first bass off the dock their grandfather built. The pond wasn't a mystery to them. It was the backdrop of every childhood memory they had. So when Tom brought home a sump pump from the hardware store and announced he was draining it, the family didn't just disagree. They mounted a full-scale intervention. His older son called it a midlife crisis. Louise threatened to spend a week at her sister's. The younger son, who'd just gotten engaged, said Tom was ruining the one thing he'd wanted to show his future kids. But Tom had stopped arguing years ago. He'd learned that the only way to prove an obsession was to finish it. He set the sump pump on a Tuesday morning while Louise sat on the porch with her arms crossed, and he turned it on before anyone could say another word. The first day was anticlimactic. The water level dropped maybe 6 inches, exposing a ring of dark, damp mud and a few rusted lures that had been lost for years. The second day was harder. The pump clogged twice, and a neighbor drove by and shouted something Tom pretended not to hear. By the third day, the water was low enough that the dock piling stood fully exposed. Their wood surprisingly sound after decades of submersion. That was when the family started watching from the porch, not just his wife but both sons, who'd driven over unannounced. They didn't speak. They just watched the waterline creep downward like a clock ticking towards something nobody could name. On the morning of the 4th day, the mud began to crack. It wasn't the random, drying earth pattern you'd expect from a drained pond. The fissures ran in straight, parallel lines, as if something beneath the silt was resisting. Tom waded into the muck with a shovel, ignoring his wife's warning to wait until it dried out. He scraped a few inches down and the blade struck stone. Not a buried rock. A cut, dressed stone with a flat face and a squared corner. He kept digging, widening the hole, and within an hour he'd uncovered the first 3 steps of a staircase that descended directly into the darkness beneath where the deepest part of the pond had been. His older son climbed down to look. The staircase was wide enough for 2 people, the steps worn smooth in the center from use. The walls on either side were lined with the same fitted stone, and the air rising from the hole was cool and dry and smelled faintly of something metallic. Tom aimed a flashlight into the opening and saw the stairs continue downward at least 20 feet before they disappeared into shadow. At the bottom, barely visible, was the outline of a stone archway, and beneath that arch, something reflected the light back. Not water, not metal, something else entirely. Tom aimed the flashlight again, bracing himself against the cold stone. The reflection at the bottom of the staircase wasn't from a puddle or a scrap of metal. It was a thick, twisting vein of galena, dark gray and heavy with silver, studding the archway like a seam of frozen starlight. His younger son, the one who'd threatened not to come to the wedding if the pond was destroyed, was now the first one down the final steps. He stopped on the threshold and let out a breath that fogged in the cool, dry air. "Dad," he said, "this is a mine." The tunnel beyond the arch ran straight for about 40 feet before it opened into a chamber. The walls were chiseled by hand, the tool marks still visible after what must have been a century and a half. A wooden ore cart, its iron wheels rusted but intact, sat on a narrow rail track that disappeared into the darkness. A pickaxe lay beside it, its handle cracked, a leather boot nearby with the sole separating from the upper. Tom's older son took a picture with his phone before anyone could tell him not to. Carved into the wall near the cart, in letters that someone had scratched with a knife and then deepened with a chisel, were the initials JKELLER and the year 1864. Tom stared at the carving so long his wife had to call his name twice. He had no memory of any relative named J. Keller from the 1800s. The family lore had always been that his grandfather Elias was the first Keller in the valley, arriving as a teenager in the 1920s. But 1864 was the middle of the Civil War, and this chamber was clearly part of something far larger than a one-man operation. They took water samples from a shallow pool near the cart, the same metallic-smelling water that had always made the cattle walk to the far trough. When the county extension office ran the tests, the results came back in less than 48 hours, flagged for immediate attention. The lead concentration was 43 times the safe limit for livestock. Arsenic was present at 9 times the threshold, and a volatile compound the lab tech described as a natural byproduct of oxidizing sulfides had been leaching into the pond for decades. Nobody in the family wanted to ask the obvious question out loud. They had all swum in that water. They'd swallowed it. They'd fed it to generations of cattle and never thought twice. None of that explained why the pond never froze or why the water level held constant through the driest summers. A hydrologist from the University of Kentucky, a woman named Dr. Anya Lowell, who had a habit of talking faster the more interesting things got, drove out the day Tom's son finally posted a photo online. She lowered a meter down the staircase and told them the mine shaft was intercepting a deep aquifer, one that pushed up through the limestone at a steady 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The pond was essentially a cap on a geothermal chimney. The dissolved minerals lowered the freezing point, which is why the winter ice never thickened beyond a slush. The cattle, with senses sharper than any humans, had known the water was wrong long before Tom ran his first pump. The revelation that the pond had been highly toxic for 3 decades sent a tremor through the family that no one was ready to name. Louise, who'd spent every August evening of their marriage floating under the willow, asked Tom in a voice barely above a whisper whether he'd ever wondered if the miscarriages her sister had suffered after swimming there were connected. He had no answer. The question itself felt like a hole opening beneath their feet. Then the State Historical Commission got involved. Dr. Lowell had forwarded the carving photos to a colleague at the Kentucky Historical Society, who recognized the date and the surname from a stack of unverified Civil War-era field reports. The reports, written by a Union quartermaster in 1863, mentioned a lost lead mine in the eastern reaches of the county that had been supplying Confederate forces with ammunition and had been sealed by local sympathizers before federal troops could seize it. No historian had ever located the entrance. The Keller farm didn't even appear in any known mining registry. Now the pieces were falling into place with alarming speed. Elias Keller hadn't dug the pond in 1941 to create a fishing hole. He'd found an old sinkhole that led to the mine entrance, and instead of reporting it, he'd paid a crew to deepen it, set the stones, and flood the shaft so completely that nobody would ever think to look twice. He'd kept the secret for 50 years, told no one as far as the county records showed, and taken it to his grave except for that one fragment he dropped to a 13-year-old grandson on a porch in the evening light. Tom's son found the second carving while Dr. Lowell was still taking water measurements. It was deeper in the chamber, behind a collapsed timber. The same J.Keller had scratched a message into the wall, dated 6 months after the first. The letters were crooked as if carved in a hurry or with a trembling hand. The message read, "They are coming. Cover the entrance. Do not let them find it." By the end of the week, 3 different state agencies had placed hold orders on the property. The mine was now officially a historical site, an environmental hazard, and a potential mineral rights jackpot all at the same time. Tom Keller, who had simply wanted to know why a pond behaved strangely, now stood at the top of a staircase that led to secrets his own great-great-grandfather had been willing to bury alive. And then the phone rang. The man on the other end identified himself as a claims attorney for a mining corporation that had been searching for this exact deposit since 1952. He said he was very interested in having a conversation before the state got any further along. Tom didn't call the attorney back. He let the phone ring through to voicemail 4 times in 2 days, the messages growing tighter each time. The mining corporation wasn't interested in the historical site or the environmental hazard. They were interested in what the Geological Survey had flagged as a significant silver lode running beneath the entire property. The kind of find that could push a small Kentucky farm onto the front page of mining journals and into a courtroom battle that would outlast anyone's bank account. Tom's sons started doing the math before anyone asked them to. The younger one, the one who'd been closest to walking away over a ruined fishing spot, now sat at the kitchen table calculating potential royalties per ton of extracted ore. His older brother had already read 3 legal opinions on mineral rights inheritance and wanted to know why a great-great-grandfather's mining claim might still hold water if it was never formally abandoned. Louise didn't join those conversations. She was still staring at the water quality report that listed the lead and arsenic concentrations she'd been soaking her body in for 30 summers. Her sister had called, voice thin, asking again about the miscarriages. Louise had no answers that didn't make her want to scream. She walked to the edge of what used to be the pond every morning before dawn and stood at the top of the stone staircase, one hand on the cold rock, listening to the air hiss up from a darkness that felt less like history and more like a wound. The State Historical Commission sent a team, then a larger one. Dr. Anya Lowell called in a favor from a forensic archaeologist named Samara Cole, who arrived in a battered Subaru with 3 hard cases of equipment and the calm, practiced gaze of someone who had excavated mass graves in 6 countries. She spent the first day mapping the chamber with ground-penetrating radar while the family waited above ground, packing. When she emerged, she asked Tom if she could speak privately before filing any official report. Tom led her to the barn, the same barn his grandfather Elias had used to store hay and keep his secrets. Dr. Cole spread a printout on the feed table. The radar showed the chamber wasn't the end of the mine. Behind the collapsed timber where the younger son had found the second carving was a void, much larger than the room they'd already explored. The timber wasn't a random cave-in. It was a deliberately constructed false wall, sealed from the outside with clay and stone, and the radar signature behind it showed multiple large, rectangular anomalies that didn't match natural cave formations. She'd seen that pattern before. It usually meant boxes, trunks, or stacked containers, and there were smaller, scattered anomalies that registered at a density consistent with bone. Tom felt the barn floor tilt. He asked if the bones were animal remains. Dr. Cole told him that the radar couldn't confirm the species, but the distribution pattern didn't look random. It looked organized, and there was something else. The surface of the false wall, once the silt was scraped away, showed scorch marks and deep gouges from tools. Someone had sealed that passage in a hurry, and someone else had tried to break back in before it was finally buried under decades of water. The next morning, a state archaeologist used a fiber optic camera to snake a cable through a gap in the timber. The team gathered around the monitor while the picture flickered and steadied. The first thing they saw was a wooden crate, rotted but intact, stenciled with a faded mark that the camera operator zoomed in on. It was an eagle over a ribbon, the quartermaster's mark for the Confederate States of America. The crate wasn't military ammunition. The lid was partially open, and the camera caught the gleam of gold coins, not minted currency but raw hand-stamped discs that glowed against the black silt like trapped fire. The live feed swung left, past another crate, then another, and froze on something that made every person in that room stop breathing. A human skull, jaw missing, rested against the wall beside a rusted lantern and a child's shoe. Then another skull, smaller, and a third behind it. The camera pulled back to reveal that the chamber floor was littered with remains, at least a dozen people, their bones tangled with personal effects, a pocket watch, a locket, a harmonica. The archaeologist's hand trembled on the cable controls. Dr. Cole asked for a moment of silence. No one spoke for a full minute. The Historical Commission's lead investigator, a man named Warren Gant who had been documenting Kentucky's lost Civil War sites for 20 years, made the connection before anyone else could form the words. He pointed at the Confederate crates, then at the bones, then at the carving of J.K.E.L.L.E.R. on the wall they'd already documented. The initials, he said, belonged to Jeremiah Keller, a name from a local legend he'd once dismissed as folk nonsense. The story told in the hollows for generations was that a wagon train of mixed-race families, Cherokee and freedmen traveling together from eastern Tennessee in the winter of 1863, had carried gold they'd earned from selling their land to a railroad surveyor. They planned to use it to buy farmland in the free territories further north. They never made it out of the valley. The official record said they'd been wiped out by Confederate bushwhackers, their bodies burned and their gold stolen for the war effort. But the local version, the one whispered in kitchens, was that the killers weren't soldiers. They were neighbors, men from the same families who ran the county government, owned the stores, and built the churches. Warren Gant pulled up a scanned diary from his tablet, a document he'd found years ago in a county archive but never been able to verify. It belonged to a local minister who wrote in 1865 about a great sin buried beneath the water, and named 3 founding families whose descendants still lived in the valley. One of them was Keller. The minister had been too afraid to speak publicly, but he'd written that the gold was never recovered for the Confederacy because it was too cursed to touch. The men who took it had hidden it in a mining shaft, then murdered the witnesses and sealed them inside. When they returned later to move the gold, something had gone wrong. A cave-in or perhaps an ambush. Jeremiah Keller, the youngest among them, had been left behind to cover the entrance permanently and warn off anyone who came looking. His message, "They are coming," had been scratched into the wall not in fear of Union soldiers, but in genuine terror of the Retribution Party that was already tracking the killers through the mountains. Dr. Cole looked at the live feed of the bones and the gold, then at Tom. She said the quiet part out loud. The pond that had been the center of every family memory, the swimming hole where Tom's sons learned to float and Louise had found peace after her sister's death, had been built as a tomb cap. Elias Keller hadn't deepened a sinkhole to hide a mine. He'd reinforced the lid on a mass grave. And every time they'd swum in that water, fished in it, laughed beside it, they'd been floating above the bones of 12 murdered people whose names no one had spoken in 160 years. The mining company called again that afternoon. This time they had a very different offer, not just mineral rights. They offered to buy the entire property outright, sight unseen, at 3 times its assessed value, with a non-disclosure agreement attached that would legally bar the family from ever discussing what was found beneath the pond. Tom stood in the kitchen. the contract already faxed to the extension office, while his sons argued about money and his wife stared out the window at the willow tree. He had to make a decision before the state moved to classify the site as a protected historical landmark, which would freeze everything. The property was still his. The secret was still his family's. And the quietest man in the valley had 48 hours to decide whether the truth was worth more than silence. Tom didn't wait 48 hours. He walked back to the house before sunset, picked up the fax contract from the mining company, and slid it into the wood stove. Then he called Warren Gant and told him to bring the full historical commission team in the morning. Louise was the first to speak afterward. She put her hand on his and said nothing. The sons, who had been calculating royalties an hour earlier, looked at their father's face and let the numbers go. The decision wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a confession the whole family had to make together. The excavation took 7 months. Dr. Samara Cole led the recovery, and every bone, every artifact was cataloged with the kind of reverence usually reserved for cathedrals. The chamber behind the false wall was 22 feet wide and 40 feet deep, larger than the ground-penetrating radar had suggested. The crates of gold coins, stamped with a railroad surveyor's mark from 1862, were stacked 6 high against the far wall, but the real weight came from the personal effects. A locket with a tintype of a woman and child, a harmonica worn thin at the edges, a child's shoe with the sole patched by hand. Each item told a story that had been smothered under water and silence for 160 years. DNA testing confirmed what the oral history had whispered. The 12 individuals were of mixed Cherokee and African descent, part of the group known in old records as the Smith-Walker Party. They had sold their Tennessee land to the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad after Cherokee removal had already fractured their community, and they were traveling north with enough gold to start over in freedom. Their names were never recorded in any official archive, but the objects they carried gave them back to history piece by piece. For the Keller family, the excavation was not a vindication. It was an undoing. Tom's older son found the name, Jeremiah, in a county ledger from 1863, listed as a paid informant for a local Confederate militia. The ledger recorded a payment of $30, the exact amount that equaled 1 share of the stolen gold. Jeremiah had not been a guardian of the secret. He had been a participant, and his message on the wall, "They are coming," had been scratched in panic as a rival faction closed in to take the gold for themselves. He died 4 months later, according to a church burial record, from a gunshot wound sustained under circumstances the minister refused to document. The Historical Commission held a public meeting in the county courthouse the following spring. The room was packed. Descendants of the 3 families named in the minister's diary were present, some of them hearing the accusations for the first time. A few walked out. One man, a great-great-grandson of the family that had owned the neighboring farm, stood up and read an apology his own ancestor had written in a letter that had stayed sealed for generations. The letter confessed knowledge of the murders, the cover-up, and the location of the mine. It had been passed down with instructions never to open it. The man said he'd done so only after the Kellers' decision made silence impossible. The bones were reinterred in a memorial plot on a hill overlooking the valley where they had planned to build their new life. A granite marker now lists each of the 12 individuals by the names they carried with them, pieced together from the locket inscriptions, a scratched nameplate on the harmonica, initials sewn into a handkerchief. Not complete identities, but enough. The ceremony drew 300 people, including representatives from the Cherokee Nation and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The gold was the final surprise. Experts assessed the hoard at just over $1.2 million in today's market, but the court ruled it could not belong to the Keller family. Under Kentucky law, it had never been legally owned by Jeremiah or any of the killers because it was stolen. The state awarded custodianship to a trust established in the name of the Smith-Walker Party, with proceeds directed toward scholarships for descendants of mixed-race families displaced during the Civil War era. Tom attended the first scholarship award ceremony without speaking. He sat in the back row, while a young woman from the same Tennessee county received a letter that would pay for 4 years of college. The pond was never refilled. The staircase remains open, protected by a locked gate, accessible to researchers and sometimes to the descendants who make the drive from Oklahoma and North Carolina. The willow tree still stands, but the water is gone, replaced by a long, sloping meadow that grows greener every year in the depression the water once filled. Louise planted wildflowers there last spring. She said it was the first time she'd felt the land was ready to give something back. The Keller farm still looks ordinary from the county road. The barn, the fence line, the cattle grazing in the near pasture. You could drive past it 100 times and never guess what was buried there. But that's the point. Most of what's hidden stays hidden, not because it's deep, but because no one bothers to look. Tom Keller spent 30 years being told he was chasing a ghost. He was told by the people who loved him most that the pond was just a pond, that the water was just water, that the past was better left alone. He ignored all of it. And because he did, 12 people who had been erased from history now have names on a granite stone. A family finally knew the truth about the place they'd called home for 3 generations. Not all of it beautiful and all of it necessary. A valley that had wrapped its founding story in silence for more than a century was forced to reckon with what that silence had cost. The question that sticks isn't about gold or silver or old stone staircases under farm ponds. It's about how many other places like this exist. How many other backyards, fishing holes, quiet patches of ground are holding something that someone once decided the rest of us didn't need to know. Tom wasn't a historian or an archaeologist or a detective. He was just a man who noticed that the pond never froze. If this story made you stop and think about what might be buried beneath someplace you've never questioned, hit subscribe. We tell stories about the secrets that stubborn people uncover when they refuse to look away. Share this with someone who might be sitting on a mystery of their own. And tell us in the comments, if you'd been standing at the top of that staircase, would you have gone down? We read them. We always do.